Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Van Hollen, members of the committee, good morning and thank you very much for having me today. I want to thank the chairlady of the Congressional Black Caucus, Ms. Marsha Fudge, who is here, and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus who have adopted this formula as an appropriate way to tackle this issue of persistent poverty. I know that all of us know that it is no secret that there are major disagreements among the members of this committee and our respective parties over the role that the federal government should play in fighting poverty and confronting many other national challenges. These disagreements, put simply, come down to a question of federal resources. I believe that we should target more resources to impoverished communities than your proposed budgets allocate. And I believe we can do so efficiently and effectively. I was privileged to have the opportunity to work through some of these disagreements with you, Mr. Chairman, last year as a member of the Budget Conference Committee, and the results, while not 100% of what either of us wanted, was a reasonable compromise on federal spending through the end of the next fiscal year. I was proud to support that agreement. Now that we have determined how much the federal government will spend, we must determine how to spend it most effectively. It is on this latter question, how to allocate finite federal resources to get the most bang for the buck, that I believe we need to work a little harder and more creatively to find common ground to make real strides in combating persistent poverty in America. Now, Mr. Chairman, there are currently 488 persistent poverty counties in America, so defined because 20% of the population has lived below the poverty line for the last 30 years or more. They are diverse, including Appalachian counties in states like Kentucky and West Virginia, Native American communities in states like Alaska and South Dakota, Latino communities in states like Arizona and Texas, American communities in states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. There are urban communities in the Northeast and rural communities in America's heartland. 139 of these counties are represented in this august body by Democrats. 331 of these counties are represented by Republicans, and 18 are split between the two parties. Combating persistent poverty should matter to all of us, regardless of party, geography, or race and ethnicity. In early 2009, when we were putting together the Recovery Act, I proposed language to require at least 10% of funds in rural development account to be directed to projects in these persistent poverty counties. This requirement was enacted into law. In light of the definition of persistent poverty counties having at least 20% poverty rates over 30 years, this provision became known as the 10-20-30 initiative. This provision bore dividends as economic development projects proliferated in persistent poverty counties across the country. The Recovery Act funded a total of 4,655 projects in persistent poverty counties, totaling at $1.7 billion. I saw firsthand the positive effects of these efforts in my congressional district. Projects were undertaken, otherwise gone lacking, and jobs were created that would have otherwise gone wanting. Among these investments was a $5.8 million grant and $2 million loan to construct 51 miles of water lines in the Britten's Neck community in Marion County, which I represented at the time, but today is represented by our colleague who sits on this committee, Mr. Rice. In Lowndes County, Mississippi, $17.5 million was spent to install a water line, elevated tank, and 2 wastewater pump stations, providing potable water to Mississippians and creating badly needed construction jobs. The Wellborn Special Utility District in Brazos County, Texas, received a $538,000 loan to construct more than 9 miles of new water distribution lines and connect over 50 households to a new water source. I come before the Budget Committee today to ask that as you decide how to allocate federal resources, you expand 10, 20, 30 to other federal agencies. In 2011, I joined with our former Republican colleague, then Representative Joanne Emerson of Missouri, to introduce an amendment to the continuing resolution that would have continued 10, 20, 30 for rural development and expanded it to 11 additional accounts throughout the federal budget, affecting economic development, education, job training, justice, the environment, and more. I hope to work with members of this committee to include similar language in future budget resolutions and other legislation. And I want to be clear about 2 things. Number 1, 10, 20, 30 is not a license to be applied to an inadequate budget. And number 2, it does not, and I want to repeat this, Mr. Chairman, 10, 20, 30 does not add 1 dime to the deficit. It simply targets funds already authorized or appropriated to needy communities. Over the past 30 years, the national economy has risen and fallen multiple times. During each economic downturn, while we have been rightly focused on getting our economy as a whole back on track, we have not given adequate attention to these communities that are suffering from chronic distress and Depression-era levels of joblessness. As a result, they have suffered even in good economic times. The 10, 20, 30 approach would provide a mechanism to address this deprivation in times of want and times of plenty, in times of federal investments, and in times of fiscal austerity. I published an article on 10, 20, 30 in the most recent issue of the Harvard Journal on Legislation. In that article, I discussed the history of our nation's efforts to address chronic and more fully lay out the case for broadly implementing 10, 20, 30 in a bipartisan fashion. I have included the full article in my written testimony so that it appears in the record.
Without objection, it will be included in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I encourage the members of this committee to please read it when you have the opportunity. I look forward to discussing this issue further and working with you to eliminate the scourge of persistent poverty in these distressed communities. Thank you so much for having me here today.